The game of the week is coming up, and it's Auburn Ole Miss. Super interesting game, because if you would have told me 3 or 4 weeks ago that Auburn was going to come out favored in Vegas in this game, I would have called you crazy. But you would have known what you're talking about, because that's exactly what we're looking at right now. An Auburn team that's favored, even though they've had their struggles in the past, and I think we're starting to see a trend here where when a team who can't defend the run and can't run the ball goes up against any team that's decent, they're probably going to be an underdog, and for good reason.
Right. Ole Miss is much maligned because they gave up a lot of yards rushing, right, to LSU. But that really, that's it. I mean, that's the problem, right? I mean, you can't give up that many yards rushing on a consistent basis and win ball games. And it's a cliche, and I know nobody really wants to hear it, but it is true. If you can't run the ball, then your offense can't operate with consistency. I can't guarantee on a given day that the quarterback's going to be hot or cold. We talked about quite a bit in the preview. When Ole Miss came off that bye week and they came in the Arkansas game, it almost looked like Arkansas was blowing out Ole Miss, as you noted, because Ole Miss was just so out of sync. They couldn't complete passes with enough consistency, couldn't keep moving the ball down the field, and they kept it close because they're still an explosive offense, but they just got out of sync. Well, how do you avoid that? Well, most championship teams become championship teams because they run the ball with a power run game. And the reason for that is, maybe my quarterback's having a good day, maybe my quarterback's having a bad day, but I've got 5 offensive linemen on the field, and at least four of the 5 are going to have at least an average day in a given day. So if I'm bigger and stronger than you, and I can push you off the ball, I can do it today, I can do it tomorrow, I can do it next week. And my running backs are going to be able to push the ball up the gut. So that gives me some sort of baseline consistency every ball game. Ole Miss does not have that, and it makes them extremely volatile. And every game Ole Miss is in, they can put up 50 and they can put up 25. But yeah, at the end of the day, if you can't stop the run, that means you're going to give up points every game. And if you can't run, that means it's going to vary whether or not you can put up points. So it all hinges off the run game. Anytime you're talking about high-level play in college football.
And what's interesting to me about Ole Miss's offense, because we've seen high-powered offenses in the past, namely with Auburn, where scheme puts them in the position to hit these giant shot plays and rack up a lot of points and yards, whereas Ole Miss is, counting on these big plays, but it's almost from it's not from creativity, and it's not from scheme, and it's not from tracking side to side, then to go vertical. It's, okay, we've got a really good quarterback and giant wide receivers, so we're probably going to hit X many 40-yard plays in this game. Well, no. You can't count on that. It's so variable. And I thought they were getting away from that when I saw the matchup they had against Alabama, where they isolated Ingram against Ronnie Harrison, and they forced a bust. And it was all based on scheme, and he's wide open. And that's the kind of thing we saw with Nick Marshall at Auburn, right? Like they do something, moves the eyes, and then you've got a guy wide open down the sideline on a wheel route, boom, 60 yards, and they do that 3 or 4 times. And that's something you can count on a little more than something super variable. But Ole Miss isn't doing that. Ole Miss, to your point, very out of sync against Arkansas, very out of sync against LSU, and it looked like it was just kind of a, lob it and pray and hope we find a way to score 40 points because we're going to give up 38.
Yeah, it is what it is, right? And we talked about that in the preview, that this style of offense is really good at winning 9 games, because you're going to have some games where you're really on point. You're going to beat somebody that you wouldn't normally expect to beat, but it's just as likely to cause you to lose some games that you shouldn't lose, because let's face it, you're chunking the ball deep. You're not going to complete those. Those are low percentage pass plays, with any consistency. So at that point, you're just basically relying on your team connecting on them more often than not. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. These things tend to happen in bunches. And when they do happen in bunches, you're good. And when they don't happen, you can go 3 and out against a really bad football team just because you have an off day. And that's what Ole Miss is, for better or worse. Like you said, I had a lot of hope for what Ole Miss was going to be this year. I told you I thought they were, a top 5 caliber team in terms of talent coming out of the Alabama game. I've said in the past that I've been pretty vocally critical of Hugh Freeze and his system. I don't think it's as much as it's good at taking a bad team and making them better. He's had a lot of talent to work with, right? I mean, he has a first-round left tackle. He had some first-round talent on defense last year. He had, number 1 receiver. Last year in particular, he had an absolute phenom quarterback, has brought the same guy back. I mean, there's a lot of talent on that squad. And, they've already lost 4 games this year. You talked about Harrison with Ingram, but I think it's telling that they didn't really try to change the formula against LSU. LSU has a phenomenal cover safety in Jamal Adams, and LSU watched the tape of the Alabama game and said, hey, we're not going to let Evan Ingram run down the field. So they had Jamal Adams shadow Evan Ingram, and all of a sudden Ingram's held to 3 receptions for 5 yards per reception. And they had a lot of targets that just didn't get completed. And they couldn't really pick up the slack, right? I mean, no other receiver had more than 4 receptions in the ball game against LSU. So, yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, Ole Miss is a very, very good team that just seems really out of sync. Now, that's kind of scary in a game like this, right? Because you feel like Ole Miss could reach up and smack Auburn at any point. But, I'm not sure that how many people after the first couple weeks of the season would have guessed that Auburn is definitely more consistently the better offense.
So I would like for you to speak a little bit, because on the heels of that LSU game, and we talked about it in the review show, where Little had to come in at left tackle, and it looked like, historically where we've seen Ole Miss have these really talented 5-star frontline guys come in and be super disruptive, which I think contributes a little bit to helping out the variability of their offense when you have the ability to force a ton of 3 and outs because you're just really getting after the quarterback or whatever. But a lot of that has hinged on frontline guys, 5-star guys that are in a top-heavy recruiting class, all panning out and then not getting injured. But then we see the opposite now. So talk a little bit about that. I know you touched on kind of how Hugh Freeze has had that talent, but talk about how the other side of it, when it doesn't pan out, kind of the result you see.
Right. And, to be fair to Greg Little, poor Gregory, we talked about it in the preview show. I mean, he got whipped by Arden Key. Now, Arden Key's a great player, but, there's a lot of great pass rushers. The problem is, as a true freshman, most of them shouldn't be playing offensive tackle, and particularly left tackle in the SEC. And there's another guy at Auburn, Carl Lawson, that may do the same thing. Why is this somewhat surprising? And I think it's unrealistic expectations that got set with some of Ole Miss's previous recruiting classes. And if you go to secfans.com and you click posts and breakdowns, we have SEC preseason breakdowns for the SEC East and the SEC West. And if you scroll down and look at Ole Miss, one of my main points, if not my main point in the Ole Miss breakdown, was that Ole Miss, not only had they recruited really well, but really they had gotten extremely lucky. Recruiting is a probability game. A 5-star is much more likely really to pan out than a 4-star. A 4-star is much more likely to pan out than a 3-star. But it's not like we go from 90% to 50 to 25. It's much more, fine grained than that. 5-star left tackle, maybe is 10% more likely to turn out to be a first-round draft pick than it being a 4-star player, and then it may be a 3-star player. There's a lot more 4-stars than 3-stars, and that's a big part of it. But most of the time, your top offensive tackle is not going to be the number 1 offensive tackle recruit. It's because there's only 2 or 3 of those guys, right? There's hundreds of those 4-star and 3-star guys. One of them, between the ages of 18 and 22, is going to randomly put on 500 pounds, grow 4 inches. because these kids are only 17 years old when they're being recruited, 16 years
Right.
old. You don't know who's going to grow up and who's not. And these are all just projections. You just know that kid right there that's a 5-star, I can virtually guarantee you he's going to be playable to play offensive tackle in the SEC. Now, there may be somebody that ends up being better, but I know this kid that's already 6'6", 330 pounds is going to be able to play. Why do I say all that? Because Hugh Freeze's ascension really came from that one, big recruiting class where he lands the number one offensive tackle in Laramie Tunsil, the number one overall player in Robert Kimdichie, and the number one receiver in Treadwell. Okay, those were all first-round draft picks. Laramie Tunsil, offensive tackle. Many thought would have gone even higher if it hadn't been for the leaks on
Being
draft
a
day.
knucklehead. Yeah.
Robert Kimdichie similarly could have been easily a top 5 pick if not for some personal issues. And then Treadwell went extremely high. But you had 3 players at number one in their position, all went first-round draft picks. I went to the 24/7 composite rankings from 2001 and on and looked at the number one overall, number one offensive tackle, and the number one wide receiver from the same class. Not assuming they signed with the same school, just those 3 players from the same class. In no other class had all 3 been a first-round draft pick. At least one of the 3 has always been a bust, except for the one time, that one time they weren't 3 years ago, and they happened to go to the same school that one time that they all panned out. So I'm not going to necessarily call Freeze lucky because some of it's evaluation, but the truth is a lot of it really was luck that they recruited, what was a very shallow class. It's worth noting that they were anywhere between 8th and 12th in most rankings, despite all these number one players, because they had about 5 4-star, 5-star players, and the rest were all 3 stars and 2 stars. They did not have anywhere near the depth of the other classes. The issue is that works when all the 5 stars end up being first-round draft picks. But if any of those 3 players, be it Tunsil, Kimdichie, or Treadwell, had not been living up to their recruiting ranking, they're not beating Alabama in 2015. Laramie Tunsil, and I mean, you can sort of excuse that, I guess, right, because he ended up being suspended. But, Robert Kimdichie was huge in that ball game. Laquan Treadwell was huge in that ball game. They needed all of them to generate a tremendous amount of production. And right now, Ole Miss, with Gregory Little, I think he'll be a very good player, but he is not an instant first down starting left tackle that Laramie Tunsil was. And that's okay, and that's pretty normal, but I think the expectations are way out of whack because what they saw, it wasn't so spectacular that they recruited that well. What I'm saying is it was spectacular that they recruited that well and those guys ended up being that good. And it's just not realistic to try to pull 3 to 5 high-level players like that and field a team out of it with any consistency. More often than not, a couple of them are going to be busts. And, those Seantrell Henderson, Tyler Love, George Farmer types. And, you're going to have some holes on your team when that happens.
So I think we've talked about Ole Miss a lot this year, given the number of games that have been either directly on our radar or just off to the side. But we haven't talked a whole lot about Auburn, and really now is just where we're getting into being able to know Auburn enough to speak to them with any kind of authority. So let's talk a little bit about Auburn. We know what they've got now. They're a power run team. They're going a little bit back to some of the offensive schemes that they've had in the past. They've got Rhett Lashley calling the plays now. And the quarterback role in terms of a thrower has taken on a diminished level and a diminished focus, but it's just one guy, which is really important. So I want to talk about Auburn offense and defense, but let's start with the offense. Start with what we touched on what we saw against Arkansas, but kind of what they're going to try to do against Ole Miss. Is it the same thing? Are they going to have to change it up a little bit? And let's just go from there.
Right. And I think the first thing out of the way is to sort of get a baseline stat idea for those that aren't fully aware. A lot of people know that Ole Miss's offense has been very productive, even with their losses. But Ole Miss is not the highest yard per attempt team in the conference. It's Auburn. I mean, Auburn is averaging 5.5 yards per rush to Ole Miss's 4.4, and they're averaging 8.6 yards per attempt to Ole Miss's 8.4 yards per attempt. So everything they've done has been very effective all season. The caveat with that is Auburn's yards per attempt total is high because they don't throw it a ton. They are definitely a run-first team. They run to set out the throw off play action. They've kind of rolled back to that Todd Graham style of offense. For the second year in a row, they've abandoned the Gus Malzahn experiment, trying to run his original offense from back from Springfield, Arkansas. You can say a lot of that is because they just don't have the quarterback to run it. I think there's probably a good argument for that. Sean White's a pretty good athlete, and those rollouts let him use his legs to get himself in space and get easy throws. I think it's also very important because Sean White's biggest detriment, and the biggest detriment he had in recruiting, is that Sean White is short. He's small. And when you roll him out of the pocket, you let him be able to see the field, you let him make throws. So I don't think it really matters who they're facing. They're going to keep some of those rollouts as part of the offense. They kind of have to because it makes things easier for Sean White. But, I don't think there's any mistaking the fact that now, Kerryon Johnson may have been carrying the workload, and I know he may be banged up, but Cameron Petway has come on strong. And with him and with a retooled offensive line, Auburn is trying to pound you up front, wear you down, demotivate you, and they're going to pass just enough to keep you honest and make you pay. And that's where Auburn historically has been their most successful with Malzahn in his system, is when they are a run-first team and that Malzahn creatively uses the passing game to punish you for overcompensating against the run.
And one of the things we're seeing now with Auburn, especially in this Arkansas game, is they're getting scores from really long chunk plays, which neutralizes one of the deficiencies that we've noticed that's been baked into this Gus Malzahn offense for the last few years, and that's red zone offense. And we even saw some of that against, let's go back this year to the LSU game where they were kind of like moving it up and down the field between the 20s and then just hit a wall when they got into that red zone. It happened a few years ago against Alabama, that Blake Sims team, where, they had a ton of yards, but all of their scores came on bombs. And they weren't getting those chunk play scores at the beginning of the season, which led to or contributed to a lot of these low-scoring games. But now, I think now that they've recommitted themselves to this style of offense, they're a little more comfortable, and it's leading to some of these large yardage chunk play scores that, again, is putting them in a position offensively that they have a little more breathing room than they had earlier in the year.
Right. I think one of the keys to sort of follow with all this is how defenses have to react to teams that are punishing the run game. You walk up the safeties is what you do, right? But it shortens the vertical reach of your defense, how far you can defend from the line of scrimmage. The earlier in a possession that Auburn can threaten the pass, the more you're playing the run early, they've got a lot of space down the field to hit you with a big play. And because you're spread out, safeties at least, back a little bit further, they have more space sideline to sideline to execute their offense. As they get closer to the red zone, the safeties no longer have to worry about defending the ball over the top because there's not enough room to throw it over the top anymore, right? The corner can stay with the receiver for 25 yards that is left on the football field. So the safeties play up. That lets them help in the intermediate passing game. That lets them help in the sideline-to-sideline run game. And it's hard to get the opponents too fooled because, again, the spacing becomes a big deal, right? If the safeties are trying to crash to the run, you can't really throw over their head because there's not enough depth for the receiver to get back behind the safeties, the linebackers. And that's why Auburn has sort of struggled when it gets in the red zone. And, I think an interesting, point to all this, I talked about how Auburn's team was a high yard per attempt team, but it was in large part because they were such a run-focused team. Auburn leads the SEC in yards per attempt at 8.6 yards per attempt. They're fourth in the SEC in yards per carry. And you would think if a team's number one in one category and number four in another category, you'd guess, right, that they'd be like number one and number two overall. They're not. They're fourth in total offense. So somehow the number 4 rush team with the number 4 rushing offense with the number 1 passing offense doesn't average out to be something greater than 4. The team is only as good as the rushing offense carries them. That's why even though they're 4 in run and 1 in the pass, they're still only 4 overall because their offense is buoyed by the run game. The two great examples above them, again, we talked about how, and this is really, really weird, okay? Auburn is better running the ball than Ole Miss play to play. They're better passing the ball play to play than Ole Miss. Ole Miss has a higher yard per play average than Auburn. Wrap your head around that statistically, how Auburn could be higher rated run game, a higher rated pass game, but Ole Miss is actually a higher rated total offense. And I'll tell you the reason why. Ole Miss has 8.4 yards per attempt to 4.4 yards per carry. Far more of Ole Miss's plays are passes. So that 8.4 yards per attempt is a much higher percentage of Ole Miss's offense. Auburn's offense has a high yard per attempt total, but it's a much lower part, much smaller part of Auburn's offense. So even though Auburn's offense is better in both in discrete categories, overall Ole Miss is more effective because Ole Miss passes the ball. They play to their strength. They play to pass the ball more often. Auburn's passing game is really effective, but their strength is really running it, and the pass is just merely a statistical result of that strength. All that said, if we want to start digging into the numbers, Ole Miss, it's going to be tough for Ole Miss to stop the run.
I think, I said I'd like to talk about Auburn's offense and defense, but I think where we're really going to show something interesting is what the computer models are going to show for Auburn's, defense and the projected output. And I haven't even seen the numbers yet, but I actually messaged you earlier today because I had a feeling that it was going to be pretty interesting. So why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Right. I think the perception nationally, right, is that Auburn's pass defense has been really, really stellar this year. Would you agree with that, coming out of the Clemson game and all?
Yeah, I've been saying it all year, and you've been kind of disagreeing with me. So
right. And I think, would you also agree that I guess the perception is that Ole Miss's run defense has been somewhat shoddy, and then the pass defense has been particularly bad of late. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that as well.
Right. Well, that doesn't quite jive with what the model's saying. And it doesn't jive, especially when you're talking about how the two teams compare to expected output from their opponents. In the pass, Auburn's pass defense is allowing 85% of opponent averages. Ole Miss's pass defense is allowing 87% of opponent averages. In fact, Auburn's pass defense and Ole Miss's pass defense are almost exactly the same statistically versus what their opponents pass. The problem is Ole Miss's opponents are averaging almost a yard per attempt more than Auburn's. Auburn, a lot of it I think was a misperception of where Clemson was at as a passing team. Again, Texas A&M is not a very good passing team right now. And then ironically, I guess to put this in perspective, Alabama, for all their struggles, has a higher yard per attempt average than anyone, as high or higher than anyone Auburn has played to this point this season. And so even though Auburn has been very, very good against those teams, their opponents haven't necessarily been so good. Now, here's the ray of sunshine and the weirdness, where Auburn has actually excelled against the run. Auburn has played some pretty darn good run teams. Their teams are averaging about 4.8 yards per carry outside of Auburn. Auburn's only given up 3.7. And on the other hand, Ole Miss has played even better run teams with 5 yards per carry, but they're giving up 5.5 yards per carry. So Auburn's only allowing 78% of opponent averages, and Ole Miss has given up about 108%, which is so Auburn, again, anything below 80 is great. 80 to 85 is good. And then, probably 80 to 90 is good. 90 to 100 is just acceptable. Anything below 100% is bad, frankly. And so Auburn is in the great category. The rush defense is great. Ole Miss's pass rush defense is bad. But what's interesting is both Auburn and Ole Miss's pass defenses are both in that good category. Neither one of them is really all that different from the other. It's just a matter of Ole Miss has played slightly better opponents and given up slightly more yardage. But I think it's kind of interesting because I think the perception is that Auburn's strength is the pass defense. And the truth is, what my stats are showing and I will point out this is a very straightforward statistical analysis, is that Auburn's actual statistical strength is the run defense, not the pass defense. It just so happens that Auburn has played teams that are a lot better at running the ball than they are throwing it, and it's skewing the perception of where Auburn's at defensively.
Well, and I think some of the pass defense, the perception of the pass defense, won't show up in the yards per attempt because the thought is their front four, front seven is really disruptive and really gets after the quarterback, especially with Carl Lawson and Adams. So I don't know where that plays into all this, especially since I don't have the numbers in front of me, but just on an eye test standpoint, or from an eye test standpoint, I feel like Auburn does a little bit better job with their front four getting after the quarterback, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe Ole Miss does as well, but honestly, I wonder if Ole Miss can't run the ball in this game. If they can't run the ball and they're having a game like they had against Ole Miss where they're having to throw it a ton, even though that's their forte, and even though maybe there are some cracks in this Auburn pass defense, what does the model tell us in terms of what Ole Miss is going to be able to do?
Right, and I think this is I will say first off, this is the point where I often will diverge from models because it's dangerous to look at these statistical models without an eye to the fact that, like, yeah, this is what the stats are saying, but the team is going to have to diverge from their game plan. It's why I thought the Tennessee-Alabama game was going to be worse than what we saw, because I thought Alabama was going to be so effective at the style of offense Tennessee was running that it was going to force Tennessee out of their usual they wouldn't be able to operate the zone read, and that was the whole hinge point of their offense, and sure enough, it shut down without it. Here, I don't know that Ole Miss is going to be too uncomfortable if they can't run it. I mean, they don't really try to establish the run. They do enough running to keep you somewhat honest, and really all they do is to run the ball when you're so sold out against the pass that they can exploit it. The biggest question to me is, was that Auburn game against Arkansas, was that indicative of where Auburn is at as a pass defense? Or was that indicative of the fact that Arkansas's played 8 games in a row in 3 straight ranked games and has gotten the crap beat out of them? I don't know the answer to that question. And that's a hard one to say, right? But I do know this. If Ole Miss has to pass the ball every play, they're going to be comfortable doing so. And if they had to run the ball, I don't know that they would be. And conversely, if Auburn needs to run it every play, they're going to be comfortable doing so. And even if they can't throw the ball, I think Ole Miss's pass defense, again, almost as good as Auburn statistically, is going to make it hard for Auburn to throw it. The problem is Auburn doesn't really care if they never throw it. They're going to run the ball every play anyway. Ole Miss isn't great against the run, so they should be able to get a lot of yardage. Similarly, Ole Miss is going to try to keep up, but now we're playing into that game where Ole Miss is in volatility mode. Their offensive line's banged up. Could they complete a lot of these passes? Sure, maybe. They could maybe beat Auburn from that. I think it's more likely than not than they don't. The one interesting thing from the whole volatility perspective, I will say, is Ole Miss is strangely a lot more efficient than Auburn in terms of scoring points. A lot of it is that between the 20 stuff we talked about, where Auburn's whole offense is running it and then exploiting gaps in your secondary spacing. We talked about a lot of that in the recap, right? That Auburn is a gap-based offense. As you get closer to the goal line and the safeties and linebackers don't have to worry about plays behind them, they can play the gaps more aggressively. And that's given Auburn a lot of difficulties in trying to score in the red zone. For that reason, Auburn gets a lot of yardage between the 20s that doesn't actually turn into points. On the other side of the equation, Ole Miss is pretty well equally able to score anywhere on the field, and so their yardage generates a lot more points, on a consistent basis than they're seeing from than Auburn is. So, getting down to the end of the day, what does all that mean? Well, it means Auburn has a really significant edge in per play totals in our model. It's 6.7 yards per play for Auburn. averaging 6 yards a carry, 7.5 yards per rush, coming out to 6.7 per play. Ole Miss, 3.4 per carry, 7.15 per rush, and that's a 5.3 yard per play average. Again, though, that's screwy because I don't really, if Ole Miss is that effective throwing and not effective running, they may solely throw the ball, and so they may not actually have 5.3 yards per play. Regardless, I base everything on yard per play scoring, and that kind of does take all that into account. And despite the fact that Auburn has a yard and a half per play advantage, Auburn's only favored here by 6. Auburn 33, Ole Miss 27. So despite everything I've said and the fact that Auburn has a lot of edges in the ball game, it goes back to one of the first points I made, and the reason I spent so much hot air talking about it, and that's that Auburn may be better in the run and maybe better at the pass, but Ole Miss is a lot more focused on the thing that they do well, and that's throwing the football. It makes them more efficient, and it helps to close the gap between where Auburn and Ole Miss are at. And that's why you end up with a prediction of only a 6-point win, 33-27, even though Auburn has a pretty significant statistical edge in this ballgame.
So that's the model, and since we do this every week, we've got a model score 33-27. Does your gut line up with that? Give me a score prediction on that, and then I'll close this out.
Right. I will say that my gut probably does not agree with that point, and the reason is I just think Ole Miss is out of sync, and I think they're beat up, and I think they may be dispirited. I don't think what we've seen historically from Ole Miss is going to carry through in this game, and for that reason, again, the model's saying that on an average day, Auburn should score 33 points on Ole Miss. I think Auburn probably pushes it a little higher. Ole Miss stays low. And we may see that Gus Bus hype train get rolling more because I think it may be something like 40-21. I mean, I'll go 37-21. We'll keep it a more of a standard score number. But, yeah, I just think Ole Miss has run out of gas and they're out of sync. Now, this could change in a hurry. And I think this game is huge for both teams. I will say that because if Auburn loses to Ole Miss and they're 2 games back, they're pretty much out of the SEC West hunt. If they beat Ole Miss, then they're with an easy schedule for the most part the rest of the way. They're looking squarely at going into that Alabama game, being able to play for the SEC West Championship. So this is a huge game, really, for both teams and where their seasons are going to head. But yeah, my gut says that Ole Miss can't keep up pace, and they're going to continue to regress from where they were at historically, even though the model doesn't support it.
So, and I think there's another thing at play here for Auburn specifically. If they lose this game, it kind of takes a lot of the air out of kind of who they thought they were becoming as a team if they can't beat a team that lost to Arkansas. So I think in addition to the goals that are measurable in terms of championships, division titles and things like that, they need this win and probably need a decent margin win to really feel good about who they are in terms of momentum as a team. That being said, I don't have as much confidence in Auburn's offense. I think Ole Miss has got some athletes where Arkansas didn't. That can shut down the run game, and I just don't know if Auburn has the ability at quarterback to really complement a run game if it gets shut down a little bit. All that being said, I still think Auburn wins, just not as high scoring as the model might show. Give me 27-21, same number LSU got or Ole Miss got against LSU. I think they're facing a similar team and a similar defense. Without a Leonard Fournette, and maybe even a little bit less at quarterback than Etling. Although, last thing I'll say, and I'll let you jump in on that before we close, where Etling can't run the ball at all, Sean White can do a little bit with his legs. So there is that.
Right, and one thing I'll note there's one big difference in that, the Arkansas and Ole Miss and LSU from what we just saw a week prior, and that's that Auburn is a zone read-based team. There's a mesh point, and there's a lot of movement in the backfield. The way you stop that is by being quick and disruptive. Arkansas was a Neanderthal team, right? Their defense wasn't very good, but the biggest reason they weren't very good is they were kind of slow. And Auburn, all that motion stuff, as we talked about in the recap, they killed Arkansas really using jet sweeps and motions. And Ole Miss has a lot more disruptive players in the front seven to get in the backfield, and that's a much more difficult thing for Auburn to do just due to style of offense. Ole Miss is a much better fit to play against that style. And similarly, you talk about Sean White being able to run the ball versus Etling. Ole Miss is going to be a lot better against a scrambling quarterback because they're a lot more athletic in the front seven than Arkansas is. Arkansas, just got humiliated by Alabama early in the year against a running quarterback. That's just not something they can handle, and I think that's why Auburn gave them so many fits. And the last thing I will note, we talked about the model. It's only 6 points, and I say my gut was, maybe even worse than that. The one thing to note, here's a caveat, is if it seems like my model at 6 is close, the line is only Auburn by 4. And
well, it opened Ole Miss giving up 1, so, and it's moved a little bit.
Yeah, so there's, it seems like, well, Auburn's got a low momentum, and that's why it is, and that's a big part of it, and the fact that Ole Miss struggled last week. But again, statistically, Auburn has the edge, and it almost makes me wonder why the line is so low. As strange as that is, this would be a great place for the Vegas to throw up a sucker bet and try to get a lot of money, easy money on Ole Miss. And, the 4 points, maybe it's enough to do that. I'm not sure. So I don't know. It's a weird line, and that makes me think something strange is at play in this game. But we'll just have to see how it plays out.
And some, kind of common sense might say that Auburn will roll in this one since, Arkansas beat Ole Miss, and Ole Miss is a little bit mentally defeated. But some teams have a weird way of coming back around on some of this stuff. So, again, I still think Auburn wins. I'm going with 26-21. I feel pretty good about that. But obviously, been wrong before, will be wrong again. So, but what will be interesting to see in this is if Auburn does win and does get that momentum, how just epic that Iron Bowl is shaping up to be, given the schedules the rest of the way, as long as Alabama can take care of business next weekend against LSU. So, y'all, that's our show for this week. This was a long one. We really enjoyed doing it. There's so much to talk about. We're doing it a little different this week in our review shows. We normally break everything up on YouTube into individual shows. We're going to try the same thing again this week, but also do it for the preview show as well. So give us some feedback. Let us know if you like that format. It's a little more modular, and you can pick and choose what you want to listen to instead of having the giant hour 20 long show. We're still going to have just the single shows on the podcast, so if you prefer the long uninterrupted shows, you can always get it that way. But give us feedback, let us know. We can obviously change it up however we want to do it. So that's it, y'all. God bless. Have a great week. See you next time.